The stamp duty thresholds that were temporarily raised during the pandemic era returned to their previous levels in April 2025, and the effect on who can and cannot afford to move home in England has been immediate, measurable, and considerably broader than the headlines at the time of the change suggested. The average stamp duty bill on a typical transaction has increased by several £1,000s overnight for buyers who previously benefited from the higher threshold, and for a specific group of buyers, those at the precise margin between buying and not buying, that increase has been enough to tip the decision. This isn't just a story about first-time buyers, though they're significantly affected. It's a story about the entire mobility of the housing market, about who can afford to upsize, who can afford to downsize, who can afford to move laterally to accommodate a new job or a changed family situation, and who is being quietly priced out of moving at all, despite owning property they'd like to sell. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly how the stamp duty change is reshaping who can afford to move, the specific groups most affected, and what the secondary effects are on the wider property market. I've been tracking the UK property market for years, and stamp duty is one of those taxes that operates mostly in the background until a threshold change makes its effect suddenly visible. Let's get into it. It's worth acknowledging the political context briefly, because it shapes how this change was communicated and how buyers were expected to receive it. The temporary stamp duty relief was explicitly framed as a temporary measure when it was introduced, and its ending was therefore technically a return to the status quo, rather than a new tax increase. That framing is technically accurate and practically somewhat misleading, because buyers who made housing decisions during the period of temporary relief, calculating affordability on the basis of the thresholds in effect at the time, did not experience the reversion as a neutral return to normality. They experienced it as a significant additional cost, appearing at the precise moment they were trying to complete transactions they had planned and budgeted around a different tax regime. Before going into the specific effects on different buyer groups, it's worth being precise about what changed and when, because the history of UK stamp duty thresholds has involved multiple temporary changes and reversions that have created genuine confusion about what the current position actually is. During the pandemic, the nil rate threshold was temporarily raised to £500,000 for all buyers and £300,000 for first-time buyers. When those temporary reliefs expired in stages, the thresholds returned to their previous permanent levels. In England, the permanent nil rate threshold for standard buyers is £125,000. For first-time buyers, there is relief available up to a threshold, but the first-time buyer relief has its own upper limit, above which no relief applies. Understanding where your specific purchase sits relative to these thresholds and how that compares to where it would have sat under the temporary higher thresholds determines the exact size of the additional cost this change has imposed. The first group most visibly affected is first-time buyers at the upper end of the affordable range. A first-time buyer purchasing at £450,000 in many parts of the country, particularly in London and the South East, is now paying stamp duty that was previously zero or substantially reduced under the higher temporary thresholds. For a buyer who has spent years saving a deposit and who has mortgage affordability calculated to the limit of their income, an additional £5,000 to £12,000 in stamp duty represents a significant problem. It either has to come from the deposit, reducing the loan-to-value ratio and potentially pushing the buyer into a worse mortgage rate tier, or from additional savings that take additional time to accumulate, delaying the purchase further in a market where prices may be moving in either direction during the wait. Neither outcome is neutral, and for the buyers at exactly the margin of affordability, the threshold reversion has been the deciding factor between buying now and waiting. Estate agents in the £400,000 to £500,000 price band, which is precisely the range most affected by the threshold reversion for first-time buyers, describe a noticeable reduction in inquiry volume since April 2025 and attribute a meaningful share of that reduction specifically to buyers who have confirmed they're waiting to accumulate more savings to cover the stamp duty before proceeding. The second group significantly affected is the move-up buyer trying to upsize from a starter home or flat to a larger property. A household that bought a two-bedroom flat as their first home 5 or 7 years ago and is now trying to upsize to a 3-bedroom house faces stamp duty on the new purchase calculated at the full standard rate on a purchase that may be in the £350,000 to £500,000 range in most parts of England outside London, and considerably more in London. The equity from the sale of the flat may be insufficient to cover both the deposit on the new property and the full stamp duty bill, particularly in markets where the flat's value has underperformed the house market, which is exactly the pattern that has been happening in recent years as the flat and house price gap has widened, a topic covered in an earlier video on this channel. The move-up buyer who has equity on paper but finds it insufficient to fund the transaction costs of moving up is a category of buyer whose mobility has been reduced significantly by the combination of the stamp duty reversion and the flat market underperformance. For these buyers, the mathematical option of extracting further equity from the existing flat through a remortgage to fund the stamp duty is limited by the same flat valuation softness that reduced the available equity in the first place, creating a circular constraint that has no easy resolution without either waiting for values to recover or reducing the target purchase price. The third group affected is the midlife downsizer who plan to sell a larger property and use the equity release from downsizing to fund retirement. A downsizer selling a £500,000 family home and buying a £300,000 flat or smaller property was, under the higher temporary thresholds, paying zero stamp duty on the new purchase. Under the current permanent thresholds, they're paying several £1,000s in stamp duty. For a downsizer whose primary financial motivation is maximizing the equity released from the move, stamp duty on the new purchase is a direct reduction in the money available to fund retirement or to pass to the next generation. The downsizer who concluded that the numbers no longer worked as well as expected is not an uncommon story since the threshold reversion, and some planned downsizing moves have been deferred or reconsidered as a direct result, contributing further to the reduction in market velocity described later in this video. The fourth group affected is the existing homeowner in a lower price band who was not affected by the temporary threshold changes when they were first introduced because their transaction fell below the old threshold in any case, but who is now finding that natural property price inflation has pushed their move-up purchase into the taxable band. This is the fiscal drag effect of the stamp duty system, the same dynamic that applies to income tax thresholds frozen while wages rise, translated into the property market. A buyer who would have bought and sold in the nil rate band a decade ago finds that the same real transaction, a modest starter home purchase in their local market, now falls above the threshold simply because nominal prices have risen with inflation and the threshold hasn't moved to match. This is a form of hidden tax escalation that requires no legislative action, no political decision, and no headline announcement. It simply operates in the background as prices rise and fixed thresholds cover a progressively smaller share of the market. The buyers affected by it rarely attribute their difficulties specifically to this mechanism, but it is one of the structural reasons why the UK housing market has become progressively less accessible to people at the lower and middle end of the income distribution over the past 2 decades. The fifth group, and the least discussed, is the cash buyer looking to invest or extend a property portfolio, who is affected by the additional dwelling surcharge on top of the standard stamp duty changes. The interaction between the standard rate threshold reversion and the elevated additional dwelling surcharge, covered in an earlier video on this channel, has reduced the commercial attractiveness of commercial investment property purchases at the smaller end of the market to the point where some potential investors are concluding that other asset classes offer better risk-adjusted returns. The exit of those investors from the market reduces competition for some properties and could in principle improve accessibility for owner-occupier buyers. But as the landlord exodus video on this channel covered, that exit also reduces rental supply, creating a separate set of consequences that offset some of the apparent benefit to buyers. Now, here's what connects all 5 of these affected groups and why the stamp duty threshold reversion has had a broader structural effect than its headline financial figure suggests. Stamp duty doesn't just affect the buyers who pay it, it affects the sellers they would have bought from, and the buyers those sellers would have moved to serve, and the overall velocity of transactions through the market as a whole. Every buyer who is priced out of moving by stamp duty is also a seller who doesn't move, which means someone else in the market doesn't get the property they were hoping to buy from them, which means another transaction doesn't happen, which means the chain of mobility that allows the housing market to allocate people to appropriate properties as their life circumstances change is constricted at every point where a marginal buyer can't quite make the numbers work. The total impact on market velocity is therefore considerably larger than the count of individual buyers directly priced out, because each priced-out buyer removes a potential transaction from a chain that would otherwise have moved multiple properties simultaneously.
Here's what nobody puts together properly. The most significant effect of stamp duty on market mobility isn't the revenue it raises, it's the transactions it prevents. Every transaction that doesn't happen because the stamp duty made it unaffordable is a household that stays in a property that doesn't fit their current needs, whether that's a couple with growing children staying in a flat they've outgrown, an older person staying in a large family home they can no longer maintain because downsizing doesn't make financial sense after stamp duty, or a first-time buyer renting for additional years while they save enough to cover both a deposit and a tax bill. All of those situations represent a misallocation of existing housing stock that no amount of new build supply can fully correct, because the problem isn't that the right properties don't exist, it's that the people who should be living in them can't afford to get there. The housing shortage debate focuses almost entirely on supply, but a meaningful share of the accessibility problem is a transaction cost problem, and stamp duty is the largest single transaction cost in most property purchases. Here's how this plays out for buyers who are close to the margin. They run the numbers, discover that stamp duty pushes their total transaction cost above what they can currently fund without reducing their deposit to a level that increases their mortgage rate enough to make the monthly payment unaffordable, and they conclude that the move needs to wait. Sometimes the wait is 6 months while additional savings accumulate. Sometimes the wait becomes indefinitely deferred as circumstances change and the urgency of the move reduces. In either case, the transaction that would have happened doesn't, and the effect accumulates across thousands of individual decisions into a measurable reduction in overall transaction volumes. Here's how this plays out for buyers who factor it in properly from the start. They include stamp duty in their total cost modeling before they begin searching, so the number isn't a surprise at the point of finding a property they want to buy. They consider whether a slightly lower purchase price, achieved through negotiation or property selection, would reduce their stamp duty bill enough to bring the total within budget, and where the purchase price is in a range where marginal changes have a significant stamp duty effect, they're aware of those thresholds and can make explicit decisions about whether a property priced just above a threshold is worth the additional tax cost compared to a similar property priced just below it.
Here's how this plays out at the market level. The stamp duty reversion has contributed to a reduction in transaction volumes compared to the period of temporary relief, a reduction that is partly attributable to the direct affordability effect on marginal buyers and partly to the psychological effect of a tax that makes moving feel more expensive than it did. Expect transaction volumes to remain below the levels of the temporary relief period for as long as the current thresholds remain in place, and expect the geographic effect to be most pronounced in the regions where average purchase prices cluster most densely around the taxable thresholds, which is to say most of England outside the lowest price regional markets, where the threshold change has had the least impact, because prices were already below the original nil rate ceiling in any case. If you are planning to move in the next year and haven't yet run a specific stamp duty calculation for your anticipated purchase price, do it now rather than at the point of finding a property. The government provides a stamp duty calculator, as do most major property portals, and the number it produces should be included in your total transaction cost planning alongside legal fees, survey costs and removal expenses, rather than being treated as an afterthought. For buyers close to any of the rate thresholds, understanding which side of the threshold your target purchase price sits on is one of the most financially significant pieces of information available before you begin negotiating, and it's information that costs nothing to have and can make a meaningful difference to how you approach both the search and the negotiation. A property priced at £251,000 attracts considerably more stamp duty than one priced at £249,000, and a negotiation that achieves a price reduction from just above a threshold to just below it is worth significantly more than the nominal value of the reduction suggests.